The American economy is weak and inefficient. The voice crackled through a 1942 Berlin broadcast, sharp, certain, designed to sound like truth. Across the Reich, radios echoed the same promise: America is soft. America is lazy. America is drowning in luxury and moral decay. Goebbels' newspapers printed photos of Depression-era soup lines, calling them proof of a dying system. Pamphlets warned that Americans lived on canned meat and factory sludge, that they couldn't fight without machines. One leaflet shouted in bold black letters, "American soldiers starve." That was the myth, simple, useful. A hungry America was a beatable America. But across the Atlantic, the factories of that weak nation never slept. Assembly lines roared through the night, turning corn into powder, cattle into rations, sugar into fuel. By 1944, the War Food Administration produced over 200 million meals each month, enough to feed every man in uniform, and still have food left for the enemy. Army Quartermaster records from that year list more than 20 billion rations produced overall, an industrial rhythm that never stopped, not even for prisoners. While Europe rationed potatoes, America shipped beef by the trainload and wheat by the ton. If America was starving, it hid it well. And that raised a question no German broadcast could answer. If Americans were truly desperate, how could they feed their prisoners the same meals they served their own? How could they hand out coffee and white bread to men who had sworn to kill them? Somewhere between the hiss of Berlin radio and the smell of cornbread in Louisiana, a belief began to crumble. Camp Ruston opened in 1943, pine woods, red soil, and a heat that clung to the skin. Behind its wire lived over 4,000 German prisoners, Luftwaffe pilots, Afrika Korps, veterans' boys, raised to believe the Reich would last 1,000 years. Reports from the camp noted dryly food was never a complaint. Prisoners ate the same meals as U.S. soldiers, sometimes better. A sergeant later recalled, "The Germans knew how to make stew taste like home." The myth of American weakness didn't explode. It eroded slowly, bite by bite. What happens when the enemy who's supposed to be starving hands you a full plate? How do you cling to superiority when your captor offers butter and coffee? November 1943. The first train from North Africa arrived at Ruston. The men were thin, sunburned, still smelling of diesel and defeat. They stepped down beneath a sky too wide, too quiet. Guards led them through the gates toward rows of wooden barracks, ball-field kitchen, watchtowers, all neat, almost bureaucratic in precision. The place looked built for order, not punishment. The prisoners whispered in German, nervous, rehearsing bits of English. One tall, sharp-jawed, a Luftwaffe mechanic wrote later, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. They had been told what to expect. Before leaving Europe, officers warned them of American cruelty. The Americans are soft," one instructor said, "but they can't stand hunger. They'll feed themselves first and leave you to rot." Within the Reich, that belief was gospel. America's strength was an illusion made of machines and sugar. The slogans were recited like prayers. The Americans eat candy bars while we eat iron. Real men live on discipline, not chocolate. They boarded the ship with that certainty, intact, convinced life behind American fences would be another front, colder, hungrier, lonelier. As the trucks rolled through Louisiana, the men stared at endless fields of corn and cotton. Carl, 24. A corporal from Bremen tried to picture decadent America. He expected slums and hunger. Instead, he saw silos full tractors, moving schoolhouses, women in bright dresses. It felt wrong, like walking through enemy propaganda. When the truck stopped at Camp Ruston, the first thing he noticed wasn't the guards, but the smell: roasted meat, onions. Something sweet drifting from a building near the gate. A young American sergeant, dark-skinned and steady-voiced, lined them up. "Line up, boys. You'll get the same as our men." Most didn't understand the words, but they caught the tone. Not cruel, not kind, simply factual. They shuffled forward, expecting thin soup and old bread. Instead, trays filled their hands: beef stew, mashed potatoes, white bread, coffee, and a small brown square wrapped in paper, Hershey's chocolate. The room went still. Forks hovered. No one moved. Some thought it a test, others a photo trick. Carl took a bite of stew, real beef, real salt. Warmth spread through his chest, confusing, almost frightening. Across the table, someone whispered, "It tastes like home." They ate quietly, spoons scraping metal. That night, several hid pieces of bread in their coats, afraid the miracle would end. Old habits of scarcity die hard. By late 1943, civilians in Germany lived on 1,500 calories a day. Here, prisoners ate more than their families back home. Days passed. Meals arrived with military precision coffee at dawn, lunch at noon, dinner before sunset. No shortages, no punishments by hunger. Red Cross inspectors noted blandly that rations met regulation. But to men raised on ration cards and blackouts, this mechanical abundance felt unreal. One would later call it a vacation by German standards. Still, distrust lingered. In the barracks, theories spread. They're fattening us for propaganda. They want to show the world how civilized they are. Carl wasn't sure. Each day without cruelty made him more uneasy. He remembered posters in Bremen showing America as chaos and greed, yet here he was, with a full stomach, clean sheets guards, who said, "Good morning." He couldn't reconcile the two. At night, he heard the hum of the generator, the echo of a baseball game under the floodlights. The Americans shouted and laughed. It didn't sound decadent, it sounded disciplined, confident, loud enough to make him feel small. By week's end, the men stopped saving bread. They ate freely, joked in halting English with kitchen staff. A prisoner cook seasoned the stew with pepper bartered from a guard. Another asked home for recipes to impress the Americans. Fear turned to curiosity. They laughed at the sweetness of chocolate, at how strange it felt to be treated as equals by an enemy. Yet beneath that laughter grew a quiet unease, a suspicion that the world they'd believed in wasn't as strong as they thought. The chocolate melted fast, leaving a taste they couldn't name. By winter's end, no one laughed anymore. The season turned cold. Frost gathered on the fences, and the noise of war faded into routine. What began as disbelief was hardening into understanding. December 1943. Camp Ruston lay still beneath a gray Louisiana sky. Frost clung to fences, pine trunks, and the corrugated roofs of the barracks. The mornings cut through uniforms, but the kitchens steamed with the smell of roasting meat. Camp records noted it plainly: food was not a complaint. The meals matched those of U.S. soldiers. A brief line in an official ledger, yet it marked something the Germans couldn't explain. That winter, America shipped beef from Kansas, butter from Wisconsin, sugar from Louisiana, not only to its troops, but to its prisoners. Trains arrived daily, crates stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster, canned peaches, powdered eggs, tins of coffee, part of the 200 million monthly military rations rolling out of Chicago, Detroit, and New Jersey factories. 3,000 meals a day. The kitchen worked like a machine. American and German cooks side by side, stirring pots large enough to drown in ovens, turning out bread the color of sunlight. The rhythm was precise, relentless. It wasn't improvisation. It was industry. And it served their captives. They began to count the numbers. The average U.S. soldier ate about 3,700 calories a day, and even prisoners averaged 3,200 to 3,500 more than triple the German civilian ration during 1944. Officers did better, but even they ate gray bread and thin soup. Here in the land they had mocked as decadent, calories came by the ton. Carl kept notes in a small ledger, a habit from his clerk days. He wrote without anger, only disbelief. Even prisoners here eat better than officers back home. Another man, wiping butter from his fingers, muttered, "Maybe America fights with sugar instead of steel." The others laughed uneasily. The laughter faded in the storerooms. Flour stacked to the ceiling, barrels of salt, crates of beef sealed in wax paper. Nothing rationed, nothing hidden. Deliveries came weekly, timed to the minute. Germany had trains too, but they carried bombs, not butter. Mocking abundance was hard when you were living inside it. Hershey bars appeared in rations, soft, sweet, melting if you waited too long. White bread, fluffy and weightless. Ice cream on Sundays. The same dessert their propaganda had ridiculed as proof of weakness now slid across their tongues like a forbidden luxury. They had laughed at indulgence. Now they were eating its proof. A few tried to write home. The Red Cross allowed 1 letter a month, 25 lines, censored twice. Mentions of abundance were struck out, but small truths slipped through. I am well. They feed us regularly. Another wrote, it is not as we were told. By early 1944, inspection reports repeated the same line: prisoners received the same rations as U.S. troops. If skilled cooks were among them, the food might even be better. Carl's disbelief turned to quiet observation. The guards trusted the system to feed even their enemies. No fear, no bribes, no shortages. The routine itself was power, the kind Germany had lost. At noon, the bugle blew. The line formed. Trays clattered. No speeches, no slogans, just chewing. The Reich, the war, the promises, all distant now, as if the ocean had swallowed them. They were taught to hate and pity Americans. Instead, they were alive because of them. The change came slowly. Jokes stopped. Pride dimmed. The word soft took on respect. The softness was organized, the kindness deliberate. When a man gains weight in captivity, the meaning of victory shifts. The shock was not pain nor hunger, but plenty, steady, mechanical, merciless plenty. For men raised on iron and sacrifice, mercy became the most disarming weapon. By spring, no one spoke of propaganda. Days were measured in meals, faith in calories, fear in silence. The Reich had promised them glory. America gave them coffee and bread, and it tasted like defeat. The fields outside turned green again, and trains kept running east with the same precision. From Ruston to Kansas to Pennsylvania, the pattern repeated: order, efficiency, abundance. What began as a rumor of American wealth had become a system without cracks. Camp Ruston was only one dot on the map. By 1944, 425 POW camps stretched across the United States, from Louisiana's pines to Kansas Plains, Texas, dust Pennsylvania snow, holding more than 425,000 Germans. Infantry officers, gunners, mechanics, all now ate in mess halls run by their former enemies. Each camp followed one rule from War Department Circular No. 1, 1944. Rations for prisoners shall conform to those of U.S. troops. It wasn't mercy, it was method. Efficiency made no exceptions. The directive came from War Department Circular No. 1, issued in 1944, a single line that standardized compassion into policy. The Quartermaster Corps didn't just feed an army, it fed the war itself. In 1944, the U.S. turned out over 20 billion military rations, 200 million sea rations each month, rolling from Chicago, Detroit, New Jersey. While Germans boiled turnips, Americans packed beef, wheat, coffee, chocolate by the ton. Food output dwarfed the Reich's eightfold, canned meat alone 12 times more. For a nation that fed the world, feeding captives was barely a ripple. Carl saw the scale up close. Assigned to the kitchen, he entered the machine itself: frozen beef from Nebraska, butter from Wisconsin, coffee sacks, stamped Brazil. No shortages, no improvisation. He asked an American cook, gray-haired and amused, "Where does all this come from?" Everywhere, the man said. That's America. The prisoners noticed too. The food was plentiful, organized, predictable. They stopped wondering if it would last and began asking for pepper. In Germany, meals followed rank officers first, prisoners last. Here everyone ate by the clock, Aero 600, 1200, 1700, the same stew, the same bread, the same coffee, always hot, always on time. Red Cross inspections confirmed what they already knew. Excellent order, equal rations. No elite tables, no hidden reserves. Americans served calories with mathematical fairness. Photographs show rows of prisoners eating shoulder-to-shoulder trays, balanced on knees, faces blank with a hunger no food could fill. This wasn't just nourishment, it was proof that a system could outfunction faith. The Reich built monuments of marble, the Americans built cafeterias. In Berlin, they carved power from stone. In the Midwest, they served it on metal trays. Realization came quietly. Superiority eroded not under gunfire but under gravy. The discipline they'd prized was matched, even surpassed, by the efficiency they had mocked. As winter deepened, Allied news crackled through the camp radios, bombings, counterattacks, surrender. In the mess halls, the rhythm never faltered. Fork-scraped boots shuffled, and a man who once barked orders in Tunisia now asked politely for seconds. They had called America weak because it was soft. But that softness was strength, a civilization that could afford decency. This was no longer a clash of armies, it was a contest of systems. By March 1944, Camp Ruston's pace had slowed to something human. Boots no longer struck the ground with urgency. Orders came without edge. Even the wind through the pines seemed gentler. Red Cross inspectors recorded hygiene and fairness, but missed what filled the silence once fear and hunger were gone. Prisoners played soccer. Guards smoked near the field. English classes met after dusk. Some men painted the Louisiana woods soft after the rubble of Italy or the sand of Tunisia. Rules allowed it. American precision made it real. One warm afternoon, Sergeant Rita Morales passed the fence carrying a dented cup. She stopped-handed it through the wire-black coffee steaming. Carl nodded and drank. No words. A gesture that slipped beneath armor. Soon the Germans cooked. Not reheating, but cooking. Former chefs from Berlin and Frankfurt took over the kitchens by invitation. Meals improved, guards noticed. A Luftwaffe sergeant who once fed bomber crews now ladled stew into American trays. We cooked better than our guards, he joked later. One night they served roast beef, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, all prepared by German hands. When the trays were passed, Americans sat beside them, eating in silence. The smell of cinnamon carried further than politics. They arrived hungry, proud, suspicious. But the routines wore that down. Laundry done, letters delivered, a baseball diamond carved into the dirt. The fences still stood, but they no longer divided hate. The change came quietly in small gestures and silence. Carl repaired stoves. Morales corrected his vowels on thank you. He practiced, failed, tried again. Another man learned the word pie and used it daily just to make someone laugh. The letters home began to shift. Once cautious and censored, they carried quiet truths. Mother, they treat us well. We eat real bread. I have gained weight. For men raised on ration lines and slogans gaining weight in captivity defied everything they'd been taught. Yet by 1945, 96% of German POWs in America were listed as well-fed. It wasn't a number, it was a revelation. Red Cross inspectors noted how few complaints were filed. The camps had flaws, yes, but in a world burning from Normandy to Nagasaki, these fenced pockets of dignity glowed like small lanterns. Carl learned coffee Sunday enough. Guards picked up bits of German. They swapped songs across the wire-played cards, sometimes simply sat together. It wasn't forgiveness or forgetting, it was coexistence, steady, wordless human. And it wasn't unique to Ruston. Across the U.S., from Arkansas to Idaho, similar moments multiplied quiet exchanges that eroded the myth that enemies must be monsters. Decency, once practiced, spread without command. One afternoon, Carl watched an American soldier rip open a box marked for POWs. Without a word, he handed it over. Carl read the label, nodded. Danke, he said. You're welcome, the soldier answered, eyes still on the crate. What began as discipline had become decency, and decency repeated millions of times became power. In a world that measured strength in bombs and factories, it was a cup of coffee that did more to end hatred than any weapon ever forged. By spring's end, the war beyond the fences was collapsing. The quiet within them was already teaching its own kind of victory. May 1945. The war that had devoured continents finally collapsed under its own weight. At Camp Ruston, the news arrived not with cheers, but stillness. The radio crackled through static. Germany had surrendered. Some prisoners froze. Others sat unsteady. A few wept quiet, ashamed. They had marched for empire and woken inside something else. For 2 years they lived in rhythm, fed, clothed, watched, worked by men who never struck them. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't hatred. Guards came and went, replaced by others just as calm. The prisoners waited for cruelty. It never came. A Luftwaffe man later called it a vacation by German standards. Another wrote, "We were told Americans were barbarians. They gave us food and books." By 1945, U.S. camps hosted over 40,000 German prisoners in education programs, English civics, even science taught by American professors. The shock was no longer material, it was moral. They had seen a world capable of restraint, and it unsettled them more than fear ever had. Beyond the wire, America kept building. Within it, the rhythm continued: beef, bread, sugar, coffee. In 1945, each German prisoner received 3,200 to 3,500 calories a day. Civilians in Germany survived on less than a third of that. They had come to conquer and learned abundance. By the time they were called home, their country had begun to starve. Karl sat at his usual table the day after the surrender. The room felt light or fragile. Guards moved quietly, prisoners said little. On the wall, a map of Europe hung with pins marking the Allied advance. Berlin was gone. The Reich that promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. The meal was the same stew-bread coffee, but it tasted like an ending. Morales walked over from the kitchen towel in hand. "Take care of yourself, soldier," she said. Her voice was neither warm nor cold, just human. Karl hesitated, then answered in careful English, "You too, and thank you." He had been trained to die for an idea. He survived to respect a people. That afternoon, a U.S. officer read a short order repatriation was underway. The war was over. The prisoners applauded not with joy but relief. Some sang softly in German hymns from childhood that no longer felt national, only personal. That night, Karl wrote his final letter from Louisiana. "Mother, I am alive. The Americans have treated us with fairness. I think now they are strong because they do not need to prove it." He folded it neatly, unsure it would ever reach her. Across the country, fences came down, trains filled with men who no longer called themselves soldiers but survivors. The Red Cross oversaw their return shoes blankets one last hot meal. Many wept not for loss, but for gratitude they couldn't name. They left heavier, healthier, changed. America had been a contradiction made real, a nation that fought total war yet practiced total restraint. They had seen factories and fairness, power and patience. The propaganda that built their faith in German destiny had never mentioned that decency could be industrial and relentless. When Karl's train crossed the Mississippi, he looked out at the fields and bridges stretching to the horizon. Abundance without arrogance. He thought of Morales's coffee, of the steady kitchen rhythm of laughter returning after the first winter. He thought how strange it was to envy the people who had beaten him. They had lost a war but found a truth strength measured not by conquest but by compassion. Years later, some would tell their children, "We saw in America what our country could have been: fair, disciplined, human." When Karl stepped onto German soil, it was rubble. Cities reduced to ash. The hunger his mother had described was everywhere: breadlines, ration cards, silence. Yet the memory of Camp Ruston stayed. It wasn't nostalgia. It was comparison. He had seen both systems, one built on fear, one on faith and order, and for the first time, defeat felt like a beginning. Summer 1946. The pines of northern Louisiana stood still in the heat, their needles softening the edges of a place once caged by wire. Camp Ruston was closing. The men were gone. The gates didn't swing wide, they opened quietly like memory. The last German folded his blanket, placed his aluminum spoon on the mess table, and looked once more toward the kitchen. It had once confused him. Now it felt sacred. Across the country, the great unwinding had begun. Between 1945 and 1946, 371, 683 German POWs were repatriated from U.S. soil, fewer than 1% ever attempting escape. Trains rolled through New York, New Orleans, and Norfolk, carrying men no longer soldiers but witnesses. Trains rolled toward the docks. Uniforms were exchanged for plain clothes. The long journey back to a broken Europe began. Karl stood at the ship's rail as Louisiana faded behind him. The sky was heavy with light. Somewhere on shore, someone was cooking corn. Coffee lingered on the wind. He closed his eyes. The country that had fed and humbled him was shrinking into the horizon. They had arrived as enemies and left as witnesses. In the years that followed, memory turned into testimony. In letters, interviews, and quiet conversations around German dinner tables, one theme returned. We learned order and humanity from the Americans. A former prisoner said it in a 1972 article. Another told his children, "My best meal was in an American camp." No monuments mark that truth. No headlines ever did. Yet food became history's quiet proof, not of victory, but a vision of what a powerful nation chose to do when no one was watching. Back home, America moved on. The camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down or reused. More than 500 POW sites faded into farmland, schools, parks, and towns. What had once been barbed wire became part of the landscape, unnoticed but not forgotten. Near Ruston, a modest museum now stands where the camp once lay. Its walls hold photographs, letters, ration cards, and a single bent aluminum spoon. One image faded but clear shows German prisoners in 1944 holding trays of food mid-laughter. Where there was wire, there are now pine trees. But the smell of bread lingers. Each week the caretaker dusts the photo. She speaks little, but when asked, she repeats the same line, "They came here to be locked up." Instead, they remembered how to live. There were no parades, no speeches, only coffee shared between hands, a spoon, a thank you whispered in uncertain English. They were prisoners, yet not hungry, not hated, and no longer fooled by the lies that had brought them to war. The Reich never understood this domination breeds resistance, but dignity changes a man from within. The war ended before the guns fell silent, when a soldier looked away instead of striking, when a cook added cinnamon, when a black sergeant handed a German boy a cup of coffee and did not flinch. Those were not acts of weakness, but of strength. Time turned the camp from memory into history, and history carefully kept became evidence. In Ruston, Louisiana, what was once one of America's largest POW camps has not been forgotten. A small museum now preserves what remains: photographs, Red Cross letters, ration cards, utensils, fragments of a quieter war. More than 4,000 German prisoners were held there between 1943 and 1946. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross Camp, Ruston consistently met Geneva Convention standards, hygiene rated excellent food, sufficient medical care regular. By 1945, prisoners received 3,200 to 3,500 calories a day, more than triple what civilians in post-war Germany survived on. Inspection logs described bunks and rows, dental stations, communal kitchens. Army menus listed corned beef, canned peaches, powdered eggs, and coffee. Photographs by the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1944 showed German POWs smiling over trays, calm, orderly, no guards in sight. When the war ended, the camp emptied slowly. Repatriation took months, sometimes years. By late 1946, most had returned home carrying stories that contradicted the propaganda they'd once believed. Some wrote memoirs remembering not the fences but the fairness. According to post-war immigration records, more than 5,000 former German POWs applied to return to the United States between 1947 and 1955. Many becoming farmers, engineers, and educators in states like Texas, Kansas, and Ohio, as documented by historian Arnold Kramer. Many cited their experiences in U.S. custody as formative. Academic studies by historians like Arnold Kramer and Barbara Schmitter-Heisler document former prisoners becoming farmers, engineers, even educators in states like Texas, Kansas, and Ohio. Declassified reports from the U.S. Army Censorship Division 1945 noted a striking shift in prisoner letters. By late 1944, growing expressions of gratitude, curiosity, and softened attitudes toward the Americans. One censor wrote, "You can see the propaganda dying in their handwriting." Some letters were withheld by German authorities upon arrival for describing treatment too humane to align with official Reich messaging. One Red Cross report from Geneva in late 1944 stated certain correspondence that described abundance of food or respectful conduct by American staff was stopped at the border by censors. A 1972 feature in Der Spiegel quoted a former Luftwaffe officer who spent 2 years in an American camp. It was not the lectures or the leaflets that changed us. It was the meals, the routine, the fact that we were treated like men. The legacy of Camp Ruston is not just the museum or the records. It is the fact that mercy, practiced daily and without spectacle, left a longer imprint than ideology. The buildings may be gone, but the records remain inked stamps reading, examined by U.S. Army handwritten menus in German logs, noting requests for extra blankets during cold months. Bread not bullets marked the difference. What the Axis powers misunderstood was that cruelty creates resistance, but quiet dignity can disarm a man from within. In thousands of small acts, spoons handed across serving lines, extra coffee poured for no reason, silence respected. American democracy proved itself not only through strength, but through restraint. And after all the rations and radio songs, what remained were the letters, quiet, careful, and full of things no one dared to say aloud. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 2 million letters traveled from American prisoner of war camps to families across Germany. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, over 1.3 million letters and postcards were exchanged every month between German POWs and their relatives. Each letter was read twice, once by U.S. Army censors, again by the Deutsche Reichspost, before being allowed to cross the ocean. The rules were strict: 1 letter and 2 postcards per month, no more than 25 lines each. But even within those limits, humanity found room to breathe. The early letters were cautious, short, polite, and stripped of emotion. They said only what was safe to say: I am well. The Americans treat us fairly. The food is adequate. But over time, those lines began to change. A letter archived by the Red Cross reads, "Dear Mother, I am well. The Americans treat us fairly. I even gained weight." Another, published later in the 1952 collection, Letters from Captivity, says, "Do not believe the papers. We are not starved. They give us coffee, even chocolate." By 1944, the shift was clear enough for officials to notice. A U.S. Army Censorship Division report from 1945 recorded that letters increasingly expressed gratitude and curiosity rather than hostility. One American officer wrote in the margin of his file, "You can see the propaganda dying in their handwriting. There were patterns, mentions of bread, of music, of warmth, small details that contradicted the image of a brutal enemy." One Luftwaffe prisoner described hearing swing music from the guards' radio during dinner. Another wrote simply, "They stand in line with us. They speak to us like men." Not all letters made it home. A 1944 Red Cross summary noted that certain letters mentioning abundance of food or humane treatment were withheld by German authorities. The Reich's propaganda machine could not afford such contradictions. Many envelopes were stopped, many words erased, but memory has no censor. One confiscated draft preserved in the Geneva archives reads, "Mother, we eat like kings." If this is captivity, then what is freedom? For the men who did manage to send their words home, each line carried a kind of quiet rebellion. They had been taught that America was weak, disorganized, decadent, yet their daily lives in the camps, 3 meals a day, books, classes, work details, even baseball games said otherwise. The letters became proof that an enemy could be efficient and kind at once. By 1945, the flow of correspondence had created its own kind of diplomacy. Soldiers who once carried rifles were now armed only with pencils. A clerk at Camp Ruston estimated that nearly 10,000 letters left the camp each month. Each one was a fragment of a larger realization: the war they were told to fight did not exist in the way they'd been promised. After the surrender, the letters did not stop. Many former POWs wrote again, this time voluntarily. In 1947 and 1948, hundreds of letters of gratitude were mailed to American families and soldiers who had treated them fairly. Many of these are still kept in the National Luftwaffe Museum in New Orleans. In one of them, a former prisoner wrote, "Your kindness changed my life. I did not expect to leave America with respect for its people, but I do. In 1971, Der Spiegel published an interview with another former POW. It was through letters, not speeches, that we learned who the Americans really were, he said. Across Germany, families kept the wartime letters for decades, folded into drawers tucked behind photographs. Some were framed, some yellowed to the color of old bread. In the post-war silence, they became artifacts of a different kind of conquest. A postcard from Texas, dated September 1944, reads, "I am alive. I have bread. I will write again." It is a small sentence, but it says everything. It disproves years of propaganda, and it captures the quiet victory of decency over ideology. The final word on the war was not written by generals or politicians. It was written by prisoners in pencil on lined paper with stamps that said examined by U.S. Army. They came to destroy America's ideals. They left describing them. History calls that defeat. Humanity calls it correspondence. Between the lines of those letters, a war ended long before the surrender was signed. In the end, this is not a tale of battles or barbed wire, but of quiet revelations served on plates sealed in envelopes and passed from hand to hand. It reminds us that true strength is not measured in firepower, but in the ability to show dignity to the defeated. When mercy is extended, not out of weakness, but out of principle, it becomes a force stronger than any weapon. In a world torn by war, it was the simple acts of decency, a warm meal, a kind word, a letter home, that helped rebuild the very idea of humanity.